Well, joining us now is Pedro Antunes, Chief Economist at the Conference Board of Canada. Pedro, thank you for dropping by.
It's a pleasure, Michael, as always.
So here we have the Bank of Canada with another decision tomorrow. And at this point, it is expected by many that we're going to look at another 50 basis point cut. So let's use that as our starting point. Begin here with the reasons why the bank may be inclined to do that.
Well, I mean, essentially, we're still sitting in a situation where interest rates are restrictive. In other words, interest rates are high enough that they are taking away from economic growth. And in terms of, kind of a policy, the bank wants to be in a situation where it's no longer taking away nor adding. In other words, they want to get to that kind of neutral rate, especially when we're seeing, I think, a lot of weakness still in the economy and a lot of stress in the economy, a lot of risks. We can talk about south of the border, but we can also talk about all of the households that still have not renewed at higher rates that are still going to be taking a hit. So when you look at economic growth over the last few quarters, you're seeing a very flat performance for Canada and no reason really to keep interest rates restrictive still.
Okay, no reason, except that there are those that are cautioning the Bank of Canada from going too aggressively too quickly. What are the reasons that they are making?
Yeah, I think it's more, I think, personally, from a standpoint from the bank, that they had that experience when they were going to put rates on hold back in 2023. It was the summer of 2023, and we saw real estate markets taking off again, and that made them a little bit nervous. So I think they want to kind of manage that soft landing, not get interest rates down too quickly to let things pick up too quickly as well. But yeah, so I think it's more of prudence on the bank's part to make sure that they've got inflation all the way to zero and that there's not anything still permeating. You could argue that there are still things that are fairly hot in the economy, and one of them is wages. And when you look at wages, in the last reading, they came down to around that 4% year over year, but they've been really tenacious at, in that close to that 5% range. And that makes a central banker nervous because a 5% wage is not in line with a 2% inflation target. It's just too high, and that will eventually lead to further inflationary pressures. So I think that's kind of the argument that the care that the bank is taking in its move.
Well, since you say inflationary pressures, and I'm thinking about the GST holiday that's about to begin across the country for 2 months, the fact that the Trudeau government also wants to distribute $250 checks to every working Canadian. Opposition parties want to see that expanded. How does the bank factor those policy decisions into its own decision about the rate, or does it at all?
Well, I mean, I think we do have very clear central bank independence because there's two issues. I mean, you just talked about these policy changes that will be stimulative on the economy, and so I think the bank does have to consider these, or will take consideration of the impacts of that. Now, it's important to remember that when we look at total CPI, if you're lowering the tax rate, that is actually going to have a negative impact on the CPI, even if it does generate some economic activity and more consumer spending. So in general, a reduction in your retail sales tax should be deflationary. So I think the bank wouldn't be too concerned about that. The extra stimulus in the $250 per person, that is a massive amount of stimulus. It comes at a time when the economy is weak, consumer spending is weak. So in that sense, perhaps the timing isn't as bad as some of the measures we saw back in 2023 when inflation was really running hot. So, I think that's one of the things the bank has to watch out for. The other thing I was alluding to is the changes that the federal government has announced in terms of immigration, and these will have a huge impact at lowering, I think, economic activity if we do see those drastic changes in the flows of immigrants in 2025. So, and I say that because the bank published the monetary policy report in October, and we didn't see any of that demographic how should I say, reality in their forecast.
Okay, so something to watch out for. So I'm wondering then, given the pros, the cons you've outlined, what's your expectation?
Well, I mean, it's hard, obviously, to read the central bankers' minds, but originally we were thinking 25 basis points. The labor force numbers came in last Friday, very strong employment numbers, but the unemployment rate ticked up even higher now, where you've got an unemployment rate that's close to 7%, and I think that's enough that it'll allow the bank to be comfortable in lowering 50 basis points. The other thing that's important here is the market expectation, as you alluded to as well. And I think the bank wouldn't want to surprise necessarily, and I think it may lean to a 50 basis point decline.
Okay, so 50 basis points, something to watch out for tomorrow. But before you go, I also want to ask you about the fall economic statement. Of course, coming in much later this year than in years past. And while we heard from the finance minister say today that it would be within their debt to GDP ratio guardrail, she would not actually comment on the deficit, which a lot of people think this government has blown through. How concerning is that?
Well, I mean, it's another situation where, you know, if we look back in the last 2 or 3 budgets, certainly in the last 2 budgets, we've seen kind of better than expected revenue projections or revenue outcomes for the federal government, and we've leaned towards spending more of those. In other words, we've not improved on the deficit situation. We've taken that extra revenue and allowed our spending to increase. So there, in this upcoming economic statement, there may well be another upswing in revenues. You know, it's hard for us to know, but you know, certainly I don't think we need any more stimulus in the economy at this time. It'd be nice to put some of that away, especially given that the $250 per household. This is really a kind of measure that is going to be much more broad-based than it needs to be. If we're really concerned about lower-income households that are struggling with the challenges of inflation and higher interest rates, we could find more targeted measures. Yeah, more targeted measures. And of course, the fall economic statement is next Monday. You and I will probably be speaking around then once again. But for now, Pedro, thank you very much for the time. You're welcome. It's a pleasure.